Thank you very much for putting on the heating this evening. I've known Mick for probably 55, 60 years, and obviously also Niamh, his wife. And when I saw the exhibition in Dublin a couple of months ago, it was astonishingly painful. And when Mick wrote to me and said, "Will you come down and for the final show in Skibbereen?" I said, "You can fuck off. It's always raining down there." And he said, "Nonsense. It's always sunshine and warm." And I said, "Okay, well, in that case, I'll bring my wife down because she's French and she likes a bit of heat and sun." So thanks a lot, Niamh and Mick. Ladies and gentlemen, it's impossible to describe the actuality of famine. And unfortunately, and probably and luckily for you, I'm the only person to have trawled many times through that existential human condition. And it doesn't bear thinking about, and it certainly can't be reproduced in painting, as Luke put in his book. And whereas poetry and song enable us to articulate the otherwise inarticulate or express the otherwise inexpressible, despite the journalist's best effort from the earliest times, as we heard Mick say, it still doesn't work. I want to pick up a few points on where Mick started, because my exposure to this happened, of course, through the media. And coming to the present, the overexposure of all of us to a constant media assault has rendered effect and sensation a nullity, to the point where when the activists and the NGOs try and make people alert to the crisis and the ridiculous prospect of more humans dying of want in a world of surplus, they are forbidden to show you the dying baby for two reasons. One, it's a cliche, and two, it's poverty porn. The words, the camera, have become prurient. The 24-hour news cycle loves this shit because you can't get enough of the Florida hurricanes, people crying, and dying babies. So I'll tell you what a dying baby is. A dying baby dying of hunger can't make any sound anymore. The muscles have actually deteriorated, so the muscles don't work. The phenomenon of the Irish famine, like all famines, is that actually relatively few people died of starvation. What they died of was disease, because the immune system collapses at a certain point, and then nature is overwhelmed with even greater nature. You die. So when you see a 2-year-old, and this is specific to me, and I don't talk about this stuff, of course, because you can't. It's the same way that Bill came back from Bergen-Belsen, and I've been around a few of those places also. When you see these human beings, and you really must keep a grip on the notion that you are amongst human beings, because they don't look like that. They don't sound like it. The sound is a low moaning. It's not a keen, it's a groan, very low, barely audible because the mouth can't do that anymore. And what you're aware of is the constant buzzing of flies. But if you pick up one of these humans and their heads seem magnified and their bodies barely exist and there is no weight and the eyes are rigid open, you're aware, you've seen the photographs, but they actually can't close their eyes. And the flies cluster around the eyes and the mouth because that stays open, but that's completely dry as well. And you lift up this human beside the elegant, sentient parents in as much agony as any of you would be to watch their child die very painfully. To die of hunger is excruciatingly painful, but you can't make any noise. There's no expression, just like it can't be expressed through the media. And the final thing is that this human shits its life through your fingers, voids itself, and is gone. So how? You tell me. How is that expressed in any known medium? It can't be. And so the rigors of what happened here are so inexpressible that there's some sort of intangibility to the whole experience of what happened to this country and some of the others I've been in. This land here is full of ghosts, and they tickle away at us because we haven't quite remembered exactly. We've used the fact of the famine. The nationalists have used it. The economists have used it. The historians have used it. The politicians have used it. The fact of the event. But out at John Kelly's farm today, Reen Farm, I had to break away from the group looking at the wonderful and mad stuff that he's created with his wife and the beautiful farm, and just walk away, because there was a sense in amongst this art that he'd made and the folly that he's created of something missing. And in 1850, what was missing was the country and the past. It had gone. And in that great national absence, in that huge psychological void, we had to reinvent ourselves. An entire class of Irish people who had spoken a different language, who worshipped a completely different God to the Catholic one that would soon be enforced upon them by Bishop Cullen, where the priests would go the stations from one house to another occasionally, but the people still went to the wells, Sunday's wells in Cork, where they still worshipped around the agricultural cycle, where they still believed in the ancient gods that had once roamed here. And we no longer knew who we were. How could we? And yet the stories of the famine are so fascinating because it isn't as we're told. The farmers who had become the bourgeoisie, they were going for it. Very few of them were affected. They were quite happy to see the peasant class, the courtiers, be decimated. It's not strictly true. that the landowners were indifferent. In this area alone, 4 of the great landowners went completely bankrupt because for 3 years they didn't take their rents to try and keep their peasants going. So these stories that we conjure up for our own political end tend to obviate the obvious, that this was mass carnage, which wasn't throughout the entire country, was in spicks and specks and spots wide. But talking to Mick today about 2 diaries I'd read, a young Irelander on the run, moving between the cottages, he never once mentions the famine. Not once. He talks about the extreme poverty he encounters. In one cabin, 3 naked children rolling in the pig shit where the pigs live, but actually sitting and rolling in it. He then talks about the food he was given. Fried badger, fresh milk, fresh butter, fresh eggs, fresh potatoes. That isn't what I read. And so when the journalist came along to try and transcribe this bizarre effect that this blight and its concomitant diseases was having, they latched onto, what's her name, Mick? Bridget? They latched onto her. When the Ethiopian famine came to our attention, Michael Burke stumbled upon this great human presence in the north of Ethiopia. He was going north to cover the Civil War, the longest running war of the 20th century. And he came upon this field where 350,000 people were sitting. Doing what? They were waiting to die. Now that's odd, except what they did in Ireland was that they walled themselves into their cabins as a family and died. Why? One of the things when Band Aid was set up, and still continues daily, was one of the trustees, still one of them, would ask, why don't they eat the birds in the camps? Why don't they eat rats? And all the NGOs were horrified and scoffed at the naivete of this man. And I said, no answer is why don't they? And there wasn't an answer. But the reality is that these were human beings. And they were dignified, and they were not going to stoop to that, even should they die. And they would cut their children's hair into a little top knot so that God could reach down and grab the kid as soon as he died. This is what it is to be human. And we lose that in the expression of the reality of famine. And when we now see the child that particularly moved me that late October evening in 1984, she was exactly as I described the innumerable ones I've seen. We did manage to get to her so that by Live 8, 20 years later, she walked out on the stage, of those of you who watched it, this beautiful Ethiopian girl of now 19, 20 or 21, who'd just done her agricultural exams in Mekelle University in northern Ethiopia. And it was as emblematic as the woman that Mick showed you. But you were incredibly fascinated by the fact that nothing had changed in media terms. Whether these newspapers had hit upon the fact that they could identify the human in the horror and through that one image tell you what was happening. But today, I don't think it works anymore. I think that with the ubiquity of the web, with the 24-hour news cycle, with the race to the bottom to try and find the stuff that will entertain us even momentarily. And as Mick explained, the Malthusian notion of population and economics that still prevails. Most of the world believe that there's too many, for example, Africans, that there's too many people in the world, that we're consuming this finite planet and all the resources in it. Africa is the most underpopulated continent in the planet. Europe is the size of one country in Africa. The United States fits into the Sahara Desert. China and Russia and South America drop without a ripple into the centre of Africa. It's vast. Nigeria will have 750 million people by 2050. Can they sustain it? No. So what famine is the collapse of systems, the failure of being human, one to another. And that's exactly what we saw in Ireland, and it's precisely what we see in Africa. And while I think it's 1951, the height of emigration was 250,000 people. That was the height of the process. Tonight on our screens we'll see more people who've crossed a desert the size of the United States to get to that 8-mile gap between the richest continent in the world and the poorest. 8 miles. And in that tiny void is all our baleful past. And I'm telling you now, it is our coming future. Because just like we left in our hundreds of thousands and continue to do so, so too they will, to get a better life, not to be hungry, to ensure that their children are never lifted up by the top knot on their head, to make sure they never have to look at these almost Martian-type creatures, their children, void their lives through their fingers. So when we talk about the Irish famine, when we talk about the country that evolved from that, and that for me has always been the birthplace of where we are, not the nonsense of 1916, that absolute cogent human reality, where one world went and disappeared and a new one had to be invented that kept the memory of this existential national event somehow alive, not in our heads, but somewhere in some mythic part of our soul. And so when Band-Aid and Live Aid happened, it was no accident that this country pro rata gave more than the rest of the world. Nepal, I think, was third, Barbados second, but this country, and of course I'm a Paddy, so that was a lot to do with it, but more to the point, there was an immediate, I think, I could be over-romanticizing this, there was an immediate association of understanding, not just there by the grace of God go I, but an understanding of the horror. And the consequences of that, the consequences of our moment, resonate today. In a study of the famines of 1944 in Holland, the year of hunger they call it, followed up by another study of the famines of China in the Cultural Revolution 1966, it became clear that not only are we negotiating what we thought were imaginary ghosts, but we negotiate with actual ghosts. That DNA is affected in any 1 year of famine, not just the DNA of the victim, but inherited from then on. And schizophrenia occurs in greater numbers amongst those affected by famine. Now we have and have had a serious history of mental health depressions. And a lot of people associate this back to this time beyond terror. And so the resonances continue in every sense of culture, of art, of politics, but actually in our own DNA structures. Famine is abhorrent. It is anti-life. It is anti what it is to be human. On that first day, when I stayed up with Midge, mixing the Band-Aid record, I took it at about 6 a.m. to the BBC, to the breakfast show. And I said on the radio that to die of want in a world of surplus is not only intellectually absurd and economically illiterate, it is morally repulsive. So what we are representing in that which is, by definition, unrepresentable, is so inherent to us, to our very structure, to the sense of self, that art can never arrive at its meaning. And that the pornographication of poverty, this poverty porn that we are dealt with, that journalists rush towards now, as opposed to Michael Burke's elegant report that so riveted a nation at 6 p.m. when it was a monomedia of BBC, where his voice could hardly speak, his shame and his rage was so intense, where he spat the words, where he made you feel what he saw. It couldn't be written. It had to be a man who suspended his journalistic objectivity. The camera at first objective in the biblical scale, as he called it, becomes the cyclops eye of the self as it focuses in on the subjective individual person who will die as your story moves on. And the effect, of course, to an entire country was to feel that shame and rage. That is journalism. And so when a tiny piece of plastic becomes the focus of that, because there is no other outlet, then you get a sort of economic phenomenon, which we were able to utilize. But this thing that I saw and responded to, as did everybody else, and was then forced to endure, I didn't want to go. So Midge and I thought we'd make 100,000 quid, give it to Oxfam, done. That's the most I can do. But the journalist came to me and said, when are you going to Africa? And I said, I'm not. And they said, yeah, well, you've got to go. And I said, I don't have to go. And they said, well, Bob, I said, I didn't have to go to Vietnam to know I was against the war there. And they said, the reality is, you're the story. If you don't go, there's nothing to cover. We've done the bit about people dying of hunger. And they were right. So I went. And in going, I saw that famine is an economic phenomenon. And that if you want to alter the economics somewhere, you must engage with the agents of change in our world. The agents of change are politicians. So that took 20 years. We got a little bit done at the G8 at Gleneagles. But I can only talk to you of what it is. But you, in this part of the world specifically, but in our country in particular, get it. And you get it and understand it and respond to it because it happened to us. And it just doesn't exist in the memories that provoke the art in Reen Farm or in Curricks. We get it because we must endure it, live with its consequences, and have this folk memory, which some people, I think, find a little doubtful as an argument. But what else explains our endless study of that terrible thing that completely changed us forever?